don't you grab yourself a snack? Open the fridge and peer on in. What do we have? Creamy yogurt, salty prosciutto, a nice Gouda cheese, kimchi, a six-pack of beer, wine, soy sauce, a jar of crunchy pickles. Each of these everyday foods and drinks have something in common. They are the product of two ancient and mysterious processes: fermentation and preservation. Smoking, curing, and salting our foods to preserve them, and using fermentation to harness the power of Earth's microbes, dramatically expanded our palates and altered the course of human history. And to think our love of these foods all started in our deep evolutionary past, when we were just a bunch of drunk monkeys. For millennia, humans have sustained themselves through a practice that they thoroughly enjoyed but did not understand. This was the mysterious alchemy of food preservation and fermentation. Author Sandor Katz has dedicated his life to studying this magical process.
I like to refer to myself as a fermentation revivalist. The intentional practice of fermentation is extremely ancient, and of course the transformations were not clearly understood in a biological scientific way. Fermentation has been regarded as a sort of magic or alchemy.
Despite its mystifying nature, fermentation has been an utterly essential process, integral to human survival.
Almost every person in almost every part of the world eats and drinks products of fermentation every single day. One historian actually estimated that 1/3 of all food that human beings put into their mouths has been transformed by fermentation. And there's always a practical benefit to fermentation. You take food from the season of abundance, and you use fermentation to get you through the season of relative scarcity. Cheese is a strategy for preserving milk. Salamis and hams and cured meats, these are all strategies for preserving meat. Sauerkraut, kimchi, and pickles, these are strategies for preserving vegetables. The food is not decomposing, and it's becoming more stable for either short or long-term preservation.
And fermentation is valued across the world for other reasons. Fermentation produces powerful intoxicants, essential nutrients, and an array of strong, alluring flavors.
Around the world, you have so many different cultural traditions, and it's part of the culinary landscape pretty much everywhere.
And there is no greater example of the cultural significance of fermented foods than a 1,000-year-old favorite of Korea, kimchi. Chef Esther Choi serves her family's fermented recipes at her restaurant Mokbar in Brooklyn, New York.
I think people make fun of Koreans for eating kimchi so often, and I think that is sort of true, so it's not even like a joke when if I don't eat kimchi with like every meal, I like freak out. That's because I ate it growing up, like every single day. My kimchi that I make at Mukbar is modeled after my grandma's. We use 3 different types of fish sauces. I believe that's what makes our kimchi so flavorful and salty and delicious.
Still remember my grandma kind of like feeding me kimchi, asking me how it tastes. I guess it was just like always embedded in my taste buds.
Pretty damn good.
Every one of my dishes showcase fermentation. A lot of it is these ingredients that have been preserved for many months.
It's so important preserving food because not only that it lasts a long time, it's so healthy for you and it just tastes incredible. You can almost taste the age.
These are how our ancestors survived the cold winters, by preserving vegetables and seafood and meats. And now it's just become such an art form.
Ooh, yeah. Thank you. Oh, more things. Oh yeah, look at all these different kimchis. People using the power of the microorganisms have, transformed the raw products of agriculture into unrecognizable forms. They smell so different. What has, transformed those products are yeast and bacteria and molds, the microbial agents of fermentation. It's spicy, but it builds slowly. Really nice crunchiness. Every chopstick full that I'm eating literally contains millions of individual bacteria. Probably this has as many bacteria as there are people in New York City, possibly many, many more.
How did our ancestors, who had no knowledge of the underlying power of microscopic bacteria and fungi, harness this phenomenon? It seems the answer is pure serendipity.
We forget that our food's alive. We forget that everything we ever eat has an ecological story. And we forget that most of those stories are totally mysterious.
This is evident in the rise of humanity's fluffy, carby obsession that became the pillar of civilization. Bread. Many scholars believe bread making may go back to Neolithic cooks, with the oldest traces of bread dating back to 14,000 BCE. Prehistoric humans likely made gruel from water and crushed grains, and cooked it on stones by the fire, much like the naan, roti, or tortillas of today. But how did we get from simple flatbread to this fluffy loaf? It all began with a fermented bread we call sourdough.
Historically, all breads that people were eating that weren't flatbreads were sourdough breads. Sourdough bread starts somewhere in the Near East or North Africa. The first sourdough bread we know of for sure is the sourdough bread that we see in Egyptian depictions. When you look at Egyptian drawings, there's a moment when all the bread goes from being like this to suddenly going to being round.
People somehow discovered the art of fermenting flour and water to make a starter.
So when you mix water and flour, there are a bunch of microbes that suddenly get access to everything they need to grow. And those bacteria are what make sourdough bread sour. And so it's kind of this whole ecosystem.
When wheat is planted, it is sure that whatever may be the setbacks, there will soon be bread.
People named their starters, they passed them from grandparent to child to grandchild. Some starters are hundreds of years old. And so there's this great way in which our human stories are embedded in the story of the bread.
Ecologist Dr. Rob Dunn launched a worldwide initiative to examine the mysteries behind humanity's oldest and most revered form of bread. He called it the Sourdough Project.
So I'm an ecologist. Being an ecologist, a lot of my life focuses on the biology of daily life. And recently it's a lot of bread. I want to know the histories. When you make a starter out of water and flour, where are the microbes that are making that ferment coming from? Where did they come from in the Fertile Crescent when breads were first made? And how do we unpack all of that story?
Rob and his team of scientists have collected sourdough samples from bakers around the world. They are sequencing the starter's DNA to unravel the microbial history of each loaf.
So we have 1,000 samples from bakers around the world.
Yeah.
And we've identified which fungi and bacteria are in there in sort of a simple way.
Yeah.
But these are 100 of the most interesting samples. I want to know the histories. I want to pull those apart. But I also want to know, how do we take advantage of the histories and the rules of ecology to make better bread?
In Copenhagen, renowned baker Lars Petersen is famous for his sourdough.
The secret of good bread is a lot of passion. I just love eating bread. I've been raised on bread. The sourdough started here is like 6 years old. We got to remember it's a live thing, you know, working with sourdough and bread making. So you have to put a lot of effort and passion into it. You have to nurse it every day, make sure it's happy, see how it develops, and then you have to be able to adapt the whole time. So the dough has its own life. It's really a challenge, but that's the only way you get a perfect bread. It's really great that we're going back in time now and taking all the skills, adapting them into this busy lifestyle we have these days, using a mill to grind your own flour. It's amazing, and I love it. We're nearly there. I have to move them around a bit. First I look at the bread. Is the crust? Is it nice and dark? And you can just smell the fresh grains, freshly milled. It has a lot of flavor. Beautiful scoring, color is just beautiful. More or less the perfect sourdough bread. Awesome.
Bread making is one of the oldest examples of humans getting microbes to work for us. But this fermented, fluffy delight was not alone. It was perhaps even matched in historical importance by powerful elixirs, like beer and wine. And our predilection for strong drink may predate our own species. 10 million years ago, the ancestors of apes and men began to explore life on the ground. There, we found overripe fruit that had fallen and begun to ferment. This transformation, a result of naturally occurring yeast, produces ethanol or alcohol. It was a taste Homo sapiens evolved to love.
The idea that early humans were fermenting things seems pretty likely, or sniffing out things that were a little bit fermented. We know that humans have a bunch of genes for dealing with alcohol that other primates don't. And we know that the first of those genes turns up really early in human evolution. And so it's possible pretty early we were looking for some funky stuff.
This gene, from deep in our evolutionary past, paved the way to one of our favorite pastimes: boozing.
Our management of fermentation, I think, probably goes back to the origins of agriculture or just before. So what we're looking at here, we have two different varieties of barley. And barley, I think, is something we don't think about a ton now, but it's one of the first domesticated crops, domesticated in the Zagros Mountains at the edge of Mesopotamia.
Early agriculture would enlighten humans to the potential of fermentation.
Farmers figured out, if you put this in water with some magical microbes and a few other ingredients, you could make beer. Imagine yourself in a small community, you're making some kind of morning porridge out of barley, and you leave it out too long. And it starts to get a little hoochie. Maybe most people wouldn't then say, like, I'm gonna try it. But someone's crazy uncle did. He would have called a neighbor over and said, hey, I just drank a bunch of this stuff. Like, I feel fantastic. And so at some early point, that gruel started to be made intentionally.
The desire to produce beer was one of the catalysts of the agricultural revolution, and beer was far from alone as the quencher of our alcoholic thirsts. In Georgia, 8,000-year-old earthen jars of wine have been discovered in the deep recesses of caves. The Egyptians made at least 17 types of beer and at least 24 varieties of wine. In ancient Mexico, the people drank a mild wine named pulque, fermented from the sap of the agave plant. But our preference for fermented beverages wasn't purely as a social elixir and provider of merriment.
The other thing that would have emerged pretty quickly is that people who were drinking beer were less likely to get sick, because the process of making the beer was fermenting the grain. It becomes a drink that's not full of pathogens, that you can make lots of and store up. And it's a way of water treatment before water treatment was available. Soon, it was being produced in huge quantities. It was a kind of money, it was a bartering chip, it could be moved from place to place, and civilization transformed around it. And so beer is a kind of a foundation stone to good living.
And time has done nothing to dull our taste for beer. In the small town of Vlezenbeek, Belgium, lies a shrine to the ancient tradition of brewing.
I'm Dirk Linnemans, the sixth generation of this family-owned brewery. It all started in 1822 when one of my grandfathers married the daughter of the brewer farmer of this building.
Belgium is one of the world's most renowned beer brewing nations, with traditions going back centuries.
Lambic is the oldest beer of the world. Before people understand that yeast was responsible for fermentation, they already used these methods. It's based on spontaneous fermentation, so we do not add yeast. We use, in fact, the nature. We use the air from nature to inoculate sugar-rich extract from the grains in order to ferment the sugar into lambic.
My name is Peter. I'm the brewmaster at Lindemans. I work now about 18 years. My father worked here all his career, more than 50 years. So lambic is in our blood. There's a big difference between a normal brewery and a lambic brewery. In a lambic brewery, every window, every door is open. The wild yeast is the most important thing in the whole brewery. In here, there are 86 different microorganisms. And the most important are those two, the Brettanomyces bruxellensis and Lambicus. In the beginning, they do nothing, but after 6 months, they start to do their job. In the worts, there are sugars. They will eat the sugars and they will transform the sugar into alcohol. And alcohol gives a taste to your beer. That's magic.
For a lot of people who are drinking lambic for the first time, they will be overwhelmed by the complexity of a lambic. But if you can define all those tastes, then we will appreciate it. It's like tasting a good wine, in fact.
To this day, beer is still one of the world's most popular beverages. In 2016, the global consumption was about 300 billion bottles of beer.
The lambic is such a story. You're drinking history, let's say.
Yet there are only 9 lambic breweries left in Belgium. And families like Lindemans are guardians of the flavors of a bygone age.
It's the old Keus, the mother of all beer. But it's a perfect thirst quencher in the summertime. It's well balanced, the sourness, very sparkling, very refreshing. Cheers.
Bread and beer, I think we can kind of think of together. They changed our daily life, right? Because we came to appreciate them, we came to think they were wonderful. And they were all a way of storing food a little bit longer. They were a way of extending our ability to move and carry food with us. Ancient Rome couldn't have been ancient Rome without bread and beer. And so they allowed empire. We could connect a vast civilization with food. And that wasn't possible before.
Our harnessing of these invisible microscopic yeasts and bacteria not only transformed our food, it transformed our culture. Since the dawn of agriculture, bread and beer were staples of the human diet. But humans cannot live on carbs alone. Fruits, vegetables, and proteins are needed to survive. And one of humanity's greatest challenges has always been the inevitable decay of the food we caught, collected, or grew. Fermentation is just one way to extend shelf life. There were other, equally important methods of food preservation.
Historically, foods have been preserved any one of a number of ways. You can dry food, you can salt it, you can put some sort of an acid on it, and that's pretty well it.
In the frozen parts of the world, inhabitants understood that by keeping their food cold, it would last longer. Dry curing with the power of the sun or smoking are the oldest of our traditional methods of preservation, dating back at least 12,000 years. Pickling dates back at least 4,000 years to people preserving cucumbers in the Tigris Valley. But there was one chemical commodity indispensable for food preservation and flavor: salt.
Salt, I think, is best seen as an essential ingredient because it was a preservative. Without it, food would have just spoiled everywhere. Salt was essential for preserving meats. Without salt, you can't make cheese, so you can't preserve milk products. So salt would have been ubiquitous everywhere. Salt was essential.
Humans need salt to survive, and our love of this tasty mineral affected the world in greater ways than just our nutrition. It became central to economies as well.
Salt was one of the first things that was widely traded because people couldn't live without salt. So salt was used as a currency because you knew that a pound of salt was worth X amount of money.
Salt routes crisscrossed the globe, from Morocco to Timbuktu, from Egypt to Greece. Salt traveled, and wealth followed.
One of the important things to remember about the spice trade is what you're transporting. The advantage of transporting salt, for example, is you can put it on a ship, you can put it on a camel, you can put it on an ox cart, and you can transport it for 6 months, a year, and it doesn't spoil. Consequently, things like salt and silk and jewelry were the first things that could be used in long-distance trade.
Trade and exploration began to explode in the 1400s. Men began to sail historically unfathomable distances in search of salt and spices. It was this blossoming desire for new flavors that propelled humankind into a new era of culinary expansion and an age of exploration. Award-winning chef J.J. Johnson uses his kitchen to express culinary traditions expanded by the age of exploration. His dishes have been inspired by ingredients and tastes from all over the world.
My mom's mom is from Puerto Rico. My dad's mom is from North Carolina. I learned majority of my cooking from my mom's mom, that's Puerto Rican. A lot of those flavors were like cumin, coriander, pink peppercorns, a lot of spices. Things that when you would walk through the kitchen, you would smell it and be like, ooh, what's that? What's cooking?
With influences from Ghana, Barbados, Puerto Rico, and Harlem, JJ uses food to tell his story.
My philosophy comes from the melting pots of the world. Migration impacts the way people cook. I'm pulling from these hubs of the world, people that have lived together for over hundreds of years and have created this unique cooking style. So the one thing that brought everyone together was the one common language, which is cooking. In this bowl, I have some black bass, some egg whites, chilies, cilantro, ginger, garlic. In my dredge, I have some rice flour, some smoked paprika, and then Jamaican curry. And I'm just gonna get this mixed up really nice. I cook with a lot of spices, and I think that helps bring that melting pot together. It's a huge part of culinary history, and I think people really forget about it.
What we consider everyday spices actually have long and complicated histories. The quests for these spices were hugely influential in the history of human exploration and economies.
What Europeans refer to as the Age of Exploration begins in the 15th century as the European countries went west. The expansion of Europe into Asia and the New World, which was motivated primarily by the spice trade, was that very, very first moment of having a genuinely globalized economy.
The arrival of Christopher Columbus in the New World changed everything. European settlers brought foods and flavors from home to the Americas. And new and exciting commodities flowed from the New World to the Old. The unprecedented level of trade and immigration would come to be known as the Columbian Exchange.
If you want to think about Europe without potatoes, if you want to think about Africa without cassava and without corn, if you think of Indian cooking without chili peppers, a native New World seasoning. There were no cows in the New World, so you couldn't have milk and cheese. The Columbian Exchange was probably the single most influential event in possibly recorded history because it changed the cuisines and the staples of whole continents.
I'm a child of the diaspora. I'm made up of all these different places. Each dish that I'm cooking represents something of who I am. I would say like the food of my childhood and then my travels. I think when a dish reflects a chef, it tastes better. Cooking to me is tracing the roots. When you're able to pull it all together, it tells a story. These flavors on this dish are from all around the world, but it's right here in New York City. And that's the story that I'm telling on a plate with all the spices and flavors together.
Despite the tasty rewards, the Age of Exploration was not an easy one for the sailors involved. Ferdinand Magellan's fateful voyage is a study in the importance of food preservation and diversity of diet.
Magellan was a Portuguese sailor who is tasked with finding the line that divides the Spice Islands, and the only way of doing this was to go around the world.
The huge demand for spices meant there was the potential for great riches to be won. Explorers and merchants risked their lives in their quest to forge new trade routes. The problem for Magellan and his men was that the techniques of food preservation had not kept up with the advances in navigation.
The early voyages were, for particularly the sailors, monstrous. They would be on that ship for months, 3, 4, 6 months. So the inability to preserve food was a huge impediment to the voyages, and so their diets on these ships, particularly the longer ones, would have been horrible.
Meal options aboard his 16th century Spanish vessels would have consisted of beer, salted meat, and biscuits. Intrepid sailors were threatened not only by dangerous conditions, but their poor diets.
There were nutritional problems, scurvy being the most famous one, when you had a large percentage of the population on board dying of scurvy, of the lack of vitamin C. You had death rates of 20, 30% sometimes.
Magellan's journey also saw a tremendous loss of life to malnutrition.
Long, difficult trip. Starts out with 5 ships, ends up with 1. They lose almost all of the people, almost all the ships, and Magellan himself. But in the process, they managed to get a nice hold full of cloves, which they're able to sell for more money than the whole voyage cost.
It took another 200 years until Captain James Cook found a defense against scurvy. Another gift of fermentation: vitamin C-rich sauerkraut. Later, it was discovered that consumption of citrus fruits prevented scurvy. The British were the first to utilize this knowledge. While limes helped to eliminate scurvy in the Navy, it was responsible for a notorious nickname: limey. Trade and exploration forever changed the diet, tastes, and cuisines of the world to what we know today. But age-old problems of spoilage still plague the new ingredients being shipped across the globe. Fermentation and the traditional preservation techniques couldn't keep up with a newly mobile populace. Necessity inspired new inventions. Beginning in the 1800s, technology began to develop at an unprecedented rate. And over the next 2 centuries, the first modern methods of preservation emerged: canning, refrigeration, and chemical preservatives. These are new means in a long tradition of prolonging the life of food to sustain our own.
The food we eat is shaped by geopolitics and governance and the movements of people, but it's also shaped by culture and deep human evolutionary histories, because those are all embedded in our foods too. And so these are always at play. I think that's an exciting thing about food culture today, is that we value culinary traditions more than we did 10 years ago. Bakers and chefs are super into it, and so there's a real opportunity to think better about it.
While ancient methods are deeply tied to our history and culture, food has changed more in the last century than in the previous 100, ushering in a new age: the industrialization of food.